I arrived before sunrise because I wanted to see the ship before it had time to lie. No escort, no ceremony, no admiral's cover on my head, just rain, steel, and a destroyer waiting in the dark. Then a petty officer decided I was a lost civilian and shoved me back from the pier. I slipped toward the cold water, and for one terrifying second, I saw how quickly arrogance could become danger. He had no idea I was the admiral sent to decide whether his ship was safe to sail. Before we begin, comment the city you're watching from, and if stories about courage, truth, and second chances speak to your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next one. I arrived at the pier in Norfolk before the sun had fully broken through the rain. The sky over the Chesapeake was the color of cold steel, low and heavy, and the wind came sideways across the water hard enough to snap the edges of my raincoat against my legs. USS Hawthorne sat ahead of me, dark and enormous against the gray morning, her lights glowing through the mist as if she had been awake long before the rest of the base. I stood there for a moment beneath the hood of my coat, watching her without moving. A ship always told the truth before people had time to arrange themselves around it. Before the polished shoes, before the prepared smiles, before the carefully worded briefings and fresh coffee. That was why I had come early. I did not want to see Hawthorne after she had dressed herself for inspection. I wanted to see her as she was. I wore my uniform under the raincoat, but my cover was tucked beneath my arm, hidden from the weather and from attention. No aide walked beside me. No driver followed. No small procession moved ahead to warn everyone that an admiral was coming down the pier. I had learned long ago that rank could change the temperature of a room before truth had a chance to speak. Men tightened their posture. Officers found their best voices. Logs appeared open on desks, clipped and ready, but steel did not perform unless someone made it. Valves did not lie with confidence. Hoses did not salute. A ship either worked when called upon, or it did not. That was the only answer that mattered to me. The deck of the pier was slick beneath my boots, rainwater gathering in shallow lines between the planks and metal plates. I had almost reached the brow when a young petty officer stepped out from the shelter of a temporary awning and planted himself directly in my path. He was broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and wearing the expression of a man who had decided the situation before he had understood it. His name tape read Callahan. Later, I would know him as Petty Officer Ryan Callahan. In that moment, he was simply a sailor blocking the way, looking at me as though I were an inconvenience that had wandered in from the wrong side of the gate. "Ma'am, you can't be here," he said. His voice carried over the rain, sharp with impatience. "This is a restricted area." I kept my own voice even. "I'm here for USS Hawthorne." That should have been enough to make him ask for identification. It should have made him follow the procedure every sailor on watch knew by heart. But he did not ask for my ID. He did not look for a badge. His eyes moved over my raincoat, my hood, my empty hands, and something dismissive settled into his face. "Visitors don't board without clearance," he said. "You need to turn around and go back to the gate." There was a time when that tone would have burned through me quickly. At 19, I would have felt the insult first, and the situation second. At 45, I had learned to let insult pass through a colder place. I studied him the way I studied equipment, not for what he wanted me to see, but for what he revealed without meaning to. He was not afraid. He was annoyed. Worse, he was certain. Certain that he knew who belonged on that pier and who did not. Certain that a woman standing alone in the rain could not possibly be the person he had been warned to expect later that morning. "I'm going aboard," I said. His jaw tightened. Behind him, another sailor looked up from beneath the awning. Young, female, alert. Her name was Emily Parker, though I did not know it yet. She watched the exchange with the uneasy stillness of someone who could feel a mistake forming but had not yet been given permission to interrupt it. Callahan stepped closer. "No, ma'am, you're not." He reached for my arm. Not hard enough to look violent from a distance, perhaps. Not hard enough in his mind to be called a shove, but hard enough to move me. Hard enough to tell me he believed his judgment mattered more than my words. His hand closed around the sleeve of my raincoat, and he pushed me back from the brow. My boot slid. For one clean, terrible second, the world narrowed to rain, grey water, and the empty space beside the pier. I felt my balance leave me. The cold wind opened under my shoulder. I saw the side of Hawthorne looming above me, her painted hull streaked dark with rain, and a flash of old instinct moved through my body before thought could catch up with it. I did not scream. I reached for something that was not there. Then a hand caught my wrist. The young sailor from under the awning lunged forward and grabbed me with both hands. She pulled hard, bracing her boots against the slick pier. Callahan froze, his face draining of certainty. For a breath, all three of us stood half-bent in the rain, caught between the ship and the water, between an ordinary mistake and the kind of mistake that follows a person for the rest of his life. I straightened slowly. My pulse was steady, but it had gone deep, beating somewhere below anger. I looked at Emily first. "Thank you, Seaman." Her eyes widened slightly at the rank I had guessed from her sleeve, but she did not let go until she was sure I had my footing. Then I turned to Callahan. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I brushed rain from the front of my coat, reached beneath my arm, and took out my cover. The gold braid caught what little morning light there was. I placed it on my head and adjusted it with both hands. The pier went silent. Callahan's face changed first. Then Emily's. Then the sailors farther back under the awning seemed to understand all at once that the woman they had watched being pushed away from the ship was Rear Admiral Grace Whittaker. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask for an apology. I did not threaten him. I looked past Callahan toward USS Hawthorne and said, "The inspection begins now." Commander Mark Ellison reached the pier less than 2 minutes after I put on my cover. Someone must have called him from the quarterdeck because he came fast, raincoat half-buttoned, one hand holding his cap against the wind, his face arranged into the careful expression officers use when they are trying to look calm and urgent at the same time. Behind him, the sailors near the brow had gone stiff and silent. Petty Officer Callahan stood where I had left him, no longer blocking my way, his hands at his sides, as if he did not trust them anymore. Emily Parker remained a step back, eyes forward, shoulders squared, trying very hard not to look as shaken as she was. Ellison stopped in front of me, took in the wet pier, my soaked coat, Callahan's pale face, and the space beside the water where I had nearly gone over. "Admiral Whittaker," he said breath-tight. "I am deeply sorry. This should never have happened." I looked at him for a moment before answering. He was in his early 50s, trim, polished, the kind of commanding officer who understood appearances because appearances had helped carry him this far. There was nothing careless in his uniform, nothing loose in his posture, but I had learned not to judge readiness by posture. "No," I said. "It should not have." His eyes flicked toward Callahan, and I saw the first shape of damage control forming behind them, not the kind done with hoses and shoring timber, but the administrative kind. Statements, apologies, separation from the scene. A formal report written cleanly enough to keep the morning contained. "Ma'am," Ellison said, "if you'll allow me, we have a conference room prepared. My officers are standing by. We can get you out of this weather, get you some coffee, and begin the scheduled brief." There it was, the polished door opening in front of me. Warm air, hot coffee, a table with folders lined in neat stacks, officers ready to explain their ship before the ship had been asked to explain itself. I had sat through hundreds of those briefings. Some were useful, some were theater with binders. The problem was that theater could become habit, and habit could become a kind of dishonesty no one recognized until smoke filled a passageway and the truth arrived too late. "No coffee," I said. "No conference room. No prepared brief." Ellison blinked once, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I did not come early to watch Hawthorne perform for me. I came early, because ships are most honest before they know they are being observed." The rain tapped steadily against the brim of my cover. I could feel water running down the back of my neck, cold and irritating, but I did not move toward shelter. If the crew had to stand watch in it, I could stand in it long enough to make my point. Your formal inspection team will arrive shortly, I continued. Until then, we begin with the watch you have right now. Not the watch you wish I had seen. Not the watch that would have been standing here after everyone had been warned twice. This one. Ellison's mouth tightened, but he nodded. Understood. I turned toward Callahan. His eyes met mine for half a second, then dropped. Fear had replaced certainty, but fear alone did not interest me. Fear made men obedient for an hour. Understanding could change what they did when no one was watching. Petty Officer Callahan, I said, you will accompany me. He swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Bring the damage control and fire safety inspection logs for the current cycle. His face changed again, not dramatically, but enough. He knew those books. More importantly, he knew his name was probably in them. Ellison stepped in carefully. Admiral, I can assign my damage control assistant or chief engineer to— You will, I said, when my team arrives. But Petty Officer Callahan will start with me. I let the words settle before adding, not as punishment for what happened on this pier. That will be handled separately. He is coming because he mistook assumption for procedure. I want him to spend the morning comparing what is written with what is real. Callahan looked up then, and for the first time, I saw something behind the embarrassment that was almost confusion. He had expected anger. Maybe he had expected humiliation. He had not expected a lesson, and he certainly had not expected to be made responsible for reading the ship's own words aloud. A runner was sent for the logs. When the binder arrived, its plastic cover was dry and clean, protected from the morning in a way the sailors had not been. Callahan took it with both hands. I watched his thumb press against the spine. You will read each relevant entry, I told him. Date, item, condition, signature. Then we will look at the equipment. Paper may say one thing. Steel, water pressure, valves, seals, and hoses will say another. My job is to find out which one is telling the truth. No one spoke. Even the rain seemed quieter under the weight of it. I turned toward the brow and finally stepped aboard USS Hawthorne. The smell met me first. Wet paint, fuel, metal, old heat trapped below decks. It was a smell I knew better than perfume, better than the polished wood of flag offices, better than the coffee Ellison had wanted to offer me. I had not begun my life in the Navy behind a conference table. I had begun it with oil under my fingernails, paint flakes on my sleeves, and my palms wrapped around pipes warm enough to remind a person that a ship was never just steel. It was a living arrangement of pressure, discipline, and trust. And as I followed the passageway down into Hawthorne's belly, I felt the old part of myself wake up. The first fire station we stopped at was not far below the main deck, close enough that I could still hear the weather shifting above us in faint metallic shivers. Rain on steel had a particular sound aboard a ship, softer from the inside but never fully gone. It followed us down the ladder well and into the passageway, where the air grew warmer and carried the familiar blend of paint, oil, damp uniforms, and machinery. Petty Officer Callahan walked beside me with the inspection binder pressed against his chest. He had not spoken since we crossed the brow. His shoulders were stiff, his face carefully blank, but his silence had changed. On the pier, he had been embarrassed. Down here, surrounded by equipment that did not care about rank or apologies, he was beginning to look uncertain. I stopped in front of the fire station and nodded toward the binder. Read it! He opened it quickly, too quickly, then steadied the pages with one hand. Fire Station 2 Alpha, he said. His voice was lower than it had been outside. Hose inspected. No visible damage. Valve checked. Pressure within standard. Nozzle operational. Signed off. He hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. Callahan, R. I looked at the hose, then at him. Again, slower. His throat moved. Hose inspected. No visible damage. Valve checked. Pressure within standard. Nozzle operational. The words sounded clean. That was the danger of a good logbook. It could make negligence look like discipline if no one bothered to test the ink against reality. I asked for the station to be charged. A sailor moved to comply, glancing first at Commander Ellison, who had followed a few paces behind us with two of his officers. Ellison gave a clipped nod. The line came alive with a dull shudder, but not the strong, immediate force I expected. The hose stiffened unevenly. When the nozzle opened, the stream that came out was not useless, but it was wrong. Thin at first, uneven, weaker than the entry in the binder had promised. It struck the deck with a flat, disappointing slap rather than the hard, controlled force that could push back heat and smoke in an emergency. No one said anything. They did not need to. A weak stream in a quiet passageway was one thing. A weak stream in a burning compartment was another. Pressure within standard? I asked. Callahan stared at the water spreading across the deck. That's what it says, ma'am. That is not what I asked. He looked at the hose again, and some color left his face. No, ma'am. We moved to the valve. It resisted on the first attempt, then gave with a rough scrape that I felt more than heard. My hand knew that sound. It was the sound of equipment that had been looked at, perhaps, but not worked, not respected, not treated as the final line between a sailor and a sealed-in death. I had one of the crew check the nozzle pattern. It responded late, then unevenly, before settling into something close to acceptable only after being forced. Close to acceptable was not the same as ready. I turned back to Callahan. Who verified this? His mouth opened, closed, then he looked down at the page. I signed the station check, ma'am. The pressure reading was entered by another watchstander. But you signed the station as ready. Yes, ma'am. His answer came out smaller this time. We continued. At the next station, the hose was worse. The outer jacket showed wear that should have been caught. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, not the sort of thing that would frighten anyone in a photograph. But I had never trusted dramatic failures as much as quiet ones. Quiet failures waited patiently. They hid behind routines, behind tired crews and copied language, behind the phrase, good enough. A senior enlisted sailor tried to explain that the hose had been scheduled for replacement, that supply delays had slowed the process. I listened, because excuses sometimes contained facts. But facts did not erase signatures. If it was waiting on replacement, I said, why was it marked ready? No one answered quickly enough. Callahan turned another page, and I saw his eyes move over the repeated words. Checked. Operational. Ready. They appeared again and again, neat as prayer, empty as breath if the equipment failed when called upon. By the third point, the atmosphere had shifted from embarrassment to dread. Commander Ellison's jaw had hardened. His officers had stopped trying to anticipate what I wanted to hear, and started watching the equipment themselves. That was always the moment I looked for in an inspection, the moment people stopped managing the visit and began seeing their own ship. Emily Parker had been assigned nearby, assisting with the stations as we moved. She stood beside a fire cabinet, young face composed, sleeves damp from handling gear. When a fitting failed to seat properly on the first try, Callahan glanced toward her. It was brief, almost involuntary, but I saw it. He was no longer imagining a faceless crew in a training scenario. He was seeing someone with a name. A sailor who might be ordered into smoke, trusting that the system behind her would answer. The water ran in a thin line along the deck, carrying flakes of old paint and gray dust toward the scupper. Its sound should have been ordinary. Instead, it reached into a part of my memory I had spent years keeping sealed. A weak line of water, a hot passageway, a logbook that had promised readiness. I looked down at that disappointing stream as it trembled under the ship's lights, and a name I had not allowed myself to say that morning rose inside me with the weight of 26 years. Casey Miller. Casey Miller's name did not come to me like a memory. It came like a door opening in a room I had kept locked for most of my adult life. I stood in the passageway of USS Hawthorne, watching that weak line of water crawl along the deck, and for a moment I was not a rear admiral. I was 19 again, thin from long watches, stubborn from pride, and young enough to believe that if a thing was written down, someone responsible had made sure it was true. Back then, I did not have stars on my shoulders. I did not have a staff, a schedule, or the authority to stop a ship from sailing. I was a junior hull maintenance technician with oil under my fingernails and paint dust in my hair, learning the Navy from the places most visitors never saw. I learned it from cramped passageways, sweating pipes, stubborn valves, bilge smells, burned coffee, and the quiet language of steel under strain. A ship teaches differently from an officer. Officers explain. Steel answers. Casey understood that before I did. He was my closest friend aboard that ship, though friendship at 19 did not always look sentimental. It looked like sharing the last decent cup of coffee at 2 a.m. It looked like laughing over bad meals, covering each other during inspections, and knowing when the other person was too tired to admit it. Casey had a way of making hard duty feel temporary. He talked about his mother constantly, not in a childish way, but with the steady affection of a son who knew exactly who had carried him into the world and expected nothing easy in return. He used to say that when he got out, he would buy a small house near her. Nothing fancy, just a porch, a patch of grass, and a kitchen big enough for Sunday dinner. I used to tease him that he talked like an old man before he was 20. He would grin and say, "Somebody has to plan a decent life." The fire happened on a night that had begun without drama. That was what people never understood about disasters. They did not always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they arrived in the middle of routine, when everyone believed the ship was tired but safe. The log said the fire system was ready. The checks had been signed. The equipment had been marked operational in language, so ordinary no one would have stopped to question it. Then the alarm came, and suddenly, ordinary words had to become real. A valve that should have answered did not answer quickly enough. A line that should have carried strength gave less than it promised. Men shouted over alarms. Smoke moved through the passageways faster than fear could organize itself. I remember reaching for a control I trusted, because the log had told me I could trust it. I remember the sickening moment when trust became doubt. Earl Thompson was the one who got me out. He was older than Casey and me, not by many years, but enough to seem carved from something steadier. He caught me when I stumbled, hauled me through smoke and heat and confusion, and pushed me toward air when my own body wanted to turn back. I remember fighting him. I remember saying Casey's name. Earl said he would go back. And he did. That part mattered. Through all the years that followed, when guilt tried to simplify the story, I held on to that truth. Earl went back. He tried. But trying is not the same as reaching someone in time. Casey died on a ship whose records said she was ready. That sentence lived inside me longer than any official report ever did. The report used careful words. It separated causes, contributing factors, maintenance failures, procedural gaps. It named systems and timelines. It did what reports are supposed to do. But no report could capture the sound of Casey talking about the house he would never buy for his mother. No report could explain what it felt like to survive, because someone pulled me out, while my best friend remained behind a failure someone else had already signed as acceptable. After that night, I stopped seeing inspection logs as paperwork. I saw them as promises. Every signature was a hand placed on the shoulder of a sailor not yet in danger, saying, "When the worst happens, this will work." And every careless signature was a betrayal made in advance. I did not become hard because I wanted power. I became exact because I had seen what softness toward falsehood could cost. Standing inside Hawthorne, 26 years later, with Petty Officer Callahan holding a clean binder full of confident words and weak water running at my feet, I felt the old promise rise in me as sharply as it had the first time I made it. If I ever had the authority, I would not let a beautiful logbook bury another young sailor. Not Casey, not Emily Parker, not anyone trusted to a ship that only looked ready on paper. By the time my formal inspection team arrived, the rain had settled into a steady gray curtain over Norfolk, and USS Hawthorne no longer felt like a ship preparing for a scheduled visit. She felt like a ship that had been caught mid-sentence. My team came aboard with clipboards, gauges, test equipment, and the quiet seriousness of people who understood that a failed system did not care how good a commanding officer looked in a briefing. I did not need to explain much. The weak fire main pressure had already said enough. Commander Ellison met them with a controlled expression, but I could see the strain working behind his eyes. He knew the inspection had changed shape. It was no longer ceremonial. It was no longer predictable. And it was certainly no longer something that could be managed with coffee, binders, and polished language. For 3 days, we moved through Hawthorne in layers. I did not inspect every bolt myself. That would have been foolish and theatrical. I had specialists for that. But I appeared at the points that mattered most, the ones that told me whether the ship had a few maintenance problems or a sickness deeper than maintenance. The first group of findings came from the fire systems. We tested stations in different compartments, under different conditions, with different sailors asked to perform the actions they would be expected to perform in an emergency. The results did not improve enough. Some lines carried pressure, but not consistently. Some valves opened, but only after too much force. One nozzle produced a pattern that looked acceptable after adjustment, but not at the first moment it would have mattered. In a real fire, the first moment was often the only one a sailor got. Petty Officer Callahan stayed with us through each test, binder in hand. His face had changed since the pier. The fear was still there, but it had become quieter, heavier. Each time he read an entry marked inspected, operational, or ready, he seemed less like a man defending himself and more like a man being forced to listen to his own voice from a distance. Some of the signatures were his, some were not. That mattered, because I did not want the crew to mistake this for a hunt aimed at one careless petty officer. Callahan had made a dangerous mistake. He had signed things too easily. He had mistaken authority for judgment, but he had not built this habit alone. The second group of findings came from personal survival equipment. That was where the younger sailors began to watch more closely. A fire hose could feel abstract to someone who had never needed one. A breathing device did not. When a sailor lifts a unit and trusts it to give him air, trust becomes physical. We found emergency breathing gear that had not been checked as carefully as the log claimed. A few units showed pressure concerns. Spare equipment was stored in ways that made sense on paper, but not in the confusion of a darkened passageway. When I asked 2 junior sailors which items were immediately ready and which were pending replacement, they looked first toward their supervisor before answering. That hesitation told me almost as much as the gauges did. A sailor should not have to search a superior's face to know what equipment can save his life. Emily Parker was present during part of that second day, assisting one of my inspectors as they reviewed a storage locker. She worked carefully, saying little, but I noticed Callahan watching her when one of the units failed its pressure check. He looked away quickly, but not before I saw the recognition settle in. The failure was no longer an embarrassment in a binder. It had a face now. It had a name. It stood in damp sleeves under fluorescent lights, young enough to still believe that the people above her had checked what they said they checked. The third group of findings troubled me most. Watertight doors. Damage control markings. Inspection logs. There were doors that closed, but not cleanly. Seals that should have been replaced. Records that repeated the same language across weeks with the lazy neatness of copied truth. I had seen this before. Not fraud in the dramatic sense, not villains hiding in corners, but a culture of small permissions. One sailor assumes the last sailor checked it. One supervisor signs because the schedule is impossible. One officer accepts a delay because the ship has to meet a deadline. Then, over time, the logbook becomes a painted surface over rust. Commander Ellison finally gave me the explanation I had expected. He did not offer it as an excuse, not exactly, but as the background he hoped I would understand. Hawthorne had been short-handed. Replacement parts had been delayed, training cycles had been compressed, the deployment schedule had shifted twice, higher headquarters wanted readiness numbers, and every department was tired. I listened, because pressure was real. I had lived under it. I had seen good crews stretched thin until they began to call survival efficiency. But when he finished, I said what I had believed for 26 years. Pressure explains how people get tired, Commander. It does not turn pretending into readiness. On the afternoon of the third day, Callahan stood beside me in a narrow passageway with the binder open to an entry he had signed 3 weeks earlier. His name was there in blue ink beside a line that said a fire station had been checked and ready. We had just proved it was not. He stared at the signature as if it belonged to someone younger, smaller, and more foolish than he wanted to admit. For For once, he did not argue. He did not blame the schedule, the supply chain, the watch rotation, or the man above him. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only I heard it clearly. "Admiral," he asked, "if there had been a real fire, what would have happened?" I called the meeting late on the third afternoon, when the rain had finally stopped, but the ship still seemed to carry the weather inside her. The conference room Commander Ellison had prepared for me on the first morning was waiting at last, neat and warm and brightly lit, but by then it no longer felt like a place for performance. The folders on the table looked less like evidence of readiness and more like witnesses. Ellison sat at the head of the table because it was his ship, but he knew before I spoke that the room no longer belonged to him. His department heads were there, along with the senior enlisted leaders and the officers responsible for damage control, engineering, and safety. Petty Officer Callahan stood near the back, not seated, hands clasped behind him, face drawn with the exhaustion of 3 days spent reading words he no longer trusted. I let the room settle into silence before I opened the final report. There are moments in command when anger would be easier than clarity. Anger fills a room quickly. It gives people something to defend against. Clarity is colder. It leaves them nowhere to hide. "USS Hawthorne is not ready for certification," I said. No one moved, though I saw the words strike each person differently. Ellison's eyes lowered for half a second. One officer pressed his lips together. Another stared at the table as if the grain of the wood could offer an appeal. Callahan did not look away. "This ship will not be cleared to sail until all critical life safety systems are repaired, retested under supervision, and verified by inspection results that match reality." I turned a page, though I knew the findings, without looking. Fire main pressure instability, delayed valve response, questionable nozzle performance, emergency breathing equipment below standard. Watertight door seals requiring correction. Logs signed as ready when equipment was not ready. None of it sounded dramatic when read in a calm voice. That was the terrible thing about official language. It could make danger sound administrative. "This is not a paperwork problem," I said. "It is not a scheduling problem. It is not a single sailor problem. This is a command culture problem." Ellison took that without flinching, but I saw the cost of it. He was not a foolish man. That almost made it worse. Foolish officers were easy to identify. Good officers, under pressure, could convince themselves that near enough was still honorable. "Admiral," he said quietly, "I accept responsibility." I studied him for a moment. "Acceptance is the beginning, Commander. It is not the repair." His face tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." I looked around the table. A ship does not become unsafe all at once. It becomes unsafe through small permissions. One missed check, one copied phrase, one signature made because yesterday's signature was there. One supervisor who assumes the sailor below him did the work. One officer who assumes the supervisor verified it. Then everyone looks surprised when the system fails. But the failure was being built in plain sight. No one interrupted me. Outside the room, somewhere deeper in Hawthorne, a pipe knocked softly as pressure shifted through the ship. I heard it and thought of Casey, but I did not speak his name there. This meeting was not about my grief. It was about their duty. When the formal actions were addressed, Callahan's shoulders went rigid. He would be removed from Pier watch duties. His conduct toward me would be entered into the record. His inspection signatures would be reviewed. He would undergo retraining in damage control procedures and remain assigned to corrective work under direct supervision. He would lose certain privileges and likely delay any near-term advancement. I saw relief and dread cross his face at the same time, because men sometimes expect destruction and do not know what to do with consequences instead. After the meeting, he found me in the passageway outside Damage Control Central. "Admiral," he said, voice rough, "I know I don't deserve to ask, but why not end my career?" I could have given him a speech about mercy. I did not. Mercy was too soft a word for what he had earned. "I am not sparing you," I said. "I am making you stay close enough to the damage to understand it," he swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. You need to learn that the boring work matters, the check nobody praises, the valve nobody photographs, the log entry nobody reads until something goes wrong. That is where sailors live or die." Later that afternoon, as my team reviewed one final corrective list, Callahan came down the passageway carrying a tag in one hand and the binder in the other. He stopped in front of me, pale but steady. "Ma'am, there's a small isolation valve near Station 3 Bravo. It isn't on the discrepancy list." One of my inspectors glanced up. "We already cleared that section." Callahan shook his head. "Not completely. The handle has play in it, and the tag history doesn't match the last inspection date. I signed near that section last month." I missed it. The room went quiet in a different way than before. He could have left it alone. No one had asked him. The report was already bad enough. Adding one more fault would not help him, but he had brought it forward anyway. I followed him to the valve, watched the inspector confirm the discrepancy, and saw Callahan stand there without looking for rescue from anyone. For the first time since I had met him on that pier, he looked less afraid of punishment than of being false. I did not smile. I did not absolve him, but I let my voice soften just enough for him to hear the difference. "That," I said, "is the first time today you protected this ship." I left USS Hawthorne without the feeling of victory. People sometimes imagine comes with command. There had been no triumph in stopping a ship from sailing. There was only the sober relief of knowing that, for the moment, the truth had arrived before the fire did. Hawthorne would be repaired. Her systems would be tested again, not assumed into readiness by tired signatures and copied phrases. Commander Ellison would answer for the culture that had grown under his command. Petty Officer Ryan Callahan would carry his consequences in his record and in his pride. But if he let the lesson do its work, he might also carry something better. Emily Parker and the other young sailors aboard that ship would one day stand in smoke, darkness, confusion, or fear with equipment that had been made honest before it was needed. That should have been enough. In a professional sense, it was enough. But as I stepped off the brow and looked back at Hawthorne under the clearing Norfolk sky, I felt the old ache I had learned to fold away inside myself. The ship behind me was safer. Casey Miller was still gone. The rain had stopped, leaving the pier slick and shining, and the water beside it had calmed into a dull gray sheet. I stood there longer than I intended, watching the surface move against the pilings, until I understood what had been pulling at me since the first weak stream hit the deck 3 days earlier. The inspection had ended, but the promise had not. There was one more place I needed to go. Earl Thompson lived outside Norfolk, in a small one-story house, with a flag by the porch and wind chimes that moved softly in the damp air. I had not seen him in years, though his name had lived in the same locked room of memory as Casey's. When he opened the door, he looked older, of course. So did I. Time had thinned his hair and deepened the lines around his mouth, but his eyes were the same, steady, guarded, carrying more than they invited anyone to ask about. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We did not need introductions. We had survived the same night, and survival is a kind of language, even when people refuse to speak it. "Grace," he said finally. "Earl," I answered. He stepped aside and let me in. We sat at his kitchen table with coffee. Neither of us really drank. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of cars passing on wet pavement outside. I told him about Hawthorne. Not every detail, not the full report, but enough. The weak pressure, the signed logs, the young sailor named Emily, the petty officer who had finally begun to understand what a false entry could cost. Earl listened with his hands folded, eyes on the table. When I finished, he nodded once, slowly. "You were thinking about him," he said. I did not ask who he meant. "Yes." Earl closed his eyes. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the years we had spent letting other words stand in for the one name that mattered. Accident. Fire. Report. Loss. Service. Duty. We had used every word around Casey Miller, except Casey Miller. Earl opened his eyes again, and his voice was rougher when he said, "I tried to get back to him. I know. I wasn't fast enough. I know that too. My own hands had tightened around the mug. I spent 26 years thinking I lived because someone else did not." Earl looked at me then, and for the first time I saw my own guilt reflected back. Shaped differently, but made of the same old smoke. "So did I," he said. That was when we finally said it. Not as part of a report, not as a whispered memory, not as something we were afraid would break us if spoken aloud. "Casey Miller," I said. Earl repeated it after me, and the room seemed to shift around the sound of his name. Later that afternoon, we went to see Mrs. Miller. She was smaller than I remembered, her hair white now, her hands delicate but firm when she took mine. I did not give her a speech. A mother who has buried a son does not need ceremony from the Navy. She needs the truth spoken with care. I told her that Casey had not disappeared into an old file. I told her that his name had stayed with me through every inspection, every refused shortcut, every moment when someone wanted a clean report more than an honest one. I told her that I could not bring him home, and I would never pretend otherwise, but that his life had helped protect sailors he would never meet. Mrs. Miller listened without crying at first. Then she touched Earl's hand, then mine, and said, "He would have liked knowing that he mattered." When I left Norfolk, the sky was still gray, but the water had gone quiet. I could not save Casey from the past. I could not give his mother back the life she had imagined for him. But every time I made a ship tell the truth, every time I refused a false signature, every time I used the authority I had been given to protect someone younger and less powerful, I was still keeping the promise I made at 19. A person's worth is not measured by whether others recognize them at first glance. It is measured by what they do when power finally rests in their hands, and whether they use it to protect the people who cannot yet protect themselves. I used to think miracles came like thunder, loud enough for everyone to notice. But now I believe God often works through quieter things. A hand reaching out before someone falls, a truth spoken before it is too late, a person choosing honesty when no one is watching. In everyday life, we may not stand on a warship or hold someone's future in our hands, but we all face moments when we can look away or do what is right. I pray this story reminds you that your small choices matter more than you know. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement, leave a comment about a moment when truth changed your life, and subscribe for more stories of courage, family, and grace. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps every day.